You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
Hello and welcome to this week's Coaching Inn. I'm Claire Pedrick, and today I'm talking to Samreen McGregor, who has a really interesting background humanly and professionally, and has recently written a book called Leader Awakened. Welcome, Samreen.
Thank you, Claire. It's lovely to be here today.
I'd love you to tell us a bit of your human story, and then we'll talk about the book, but tell us about you.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, gosh, there's so many different facets to my human story, but the one that comes to me straight away as I hear you ask the question is who I am and what my life and upbringing and roots project, from that point of view. I was born and raised in Venezuela, and this was in the 1970s, and my parents are from very, very different cultures. So my mother's from Venezuela, and my dad was very fortunate to have met her in the States, having studied with her. And he studied petroleum engineering, and Venezuela is the fifth biggest oil producer in the world. So he followed her down to Venezuela from California. And the relevance of that is, for me, is that I grew up in a very international setting. I went to an international American school. It was an international school, but most teachers were from the States, just because of the geographical location of Caracas in Venezuela, the northernmost country. And so I was raised in that very international context. And then when I was 14, we moved to the UK and continued that kind of education, but lived in a very different place. And then we traveled quite a lot throughout my life. My dad had a dream that he wanted us to see the world, and boy, did we. And continue to do so. I think the last few years has been a bit of a slowdown. But yeah, I think that for me is really an important part of my personal, I guess, who I am, my experience, and it typifies the way in which I see myself. And there is a shadow side to that, because, with all the curiosity and all the diversity that I experienced as an individual who my dad would call a global citizen when I was a young child, it definitely carries confusion sometimes, and a worry about not being rooted, and comparisons with people who are. So yeah, that would probably be one of many human aspects to me.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about the word belonging,
and
that wonderful thing from Maya Angelou that says, I belong everywhere, I belong nowhere, no place at all.
Yeah.
The price is high, the reward is great.
Yes, I think that's a gorgeous quote, and it sort of touches me very deeply inside.
So you're an international citizen.
Yes.
But the tribe of international citizens are all different.
And we are very different. And I think there's another layer which I realized as I was writing this book that I recently published, that as I was writing about being a sort of international global citizen, I reflected on myself as a child, as a daughter, as an adult and the professional, and more recently in the last 16 years now, as a mother, actually, and having married a British man. And the two of us, although we share a huge amount of interest in looking at different cultures and immersing ourselves in all that, I do get corrected by my children for my accent or for my idiom and what I get right or wrong. And so, I mean, that's a tiny example, but even in terms of mindset and customs, there are, yes, I sometimes feel I don't even belong there, even though, of course, we love each other and we're very much a close family. But yes, it does, as a sort of third culture, mother as well as a third culture child. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I had third culture child on my list.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, but that's interesting because you're describing the same but totally different.
Yes.
Because your third culture child experience, I imagine, is very different. Well, is it different from your third culture mother experience?
Do you know, I've not considered that question. It's such an excellent question, and it is different. And I guess where my mind goes is I consider how I was raised by two amazing people, but who many times they had their own things going on because they both worked, and we were in that environment where we were in Venezuela. So, Spanish speaking, and culturally that was the dominant place. And both my parents worked for, a government-owned Venezuelan oil business. Actually, it was private. It was private at the time, and then eventually it became government-owned. But it very Venezuelan setting, and my father learned Spanish to work there because he's Indian.
Wow.
And I've forgotten that bit. And they, it's funny, my dad was persuaded by a medical doctor at the time who had suggested that it's better for a child not to learn more than one language because it delays their development, which to a certain extent can be true, but it only delays it, in the moment. And then over time, it sort of really diversifies and enriches it. But actually, the more I learn about my dad over his lifetime, the more I realize part of his decision to enforce basically a bit of a policy in our home that we only spoke in English, which is really interesting living in Venezuela, may have been a reflection on him feeling left out and that he didn't belong. And so that was a very, and I'm only making reference to language, but that probably extended itself more culturally. And I think as a third culture mother, I'm far more wise, mature, and very skilled. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way, but skilled because I feel that I've had the fortune of having worked in organizations, and particularly in the field that I work in, that meant I've done some fairly deep work about, why do I get upset about certain things? Why do I have maybe obsessive or disproportionate reactions in situations, and can't understand, sometimes it's anger, why is it feels unfair that you're pointing out that what I'm saying doesn't fit the mold of the dominant culture. And that applies as in my immediate family, in my extended family, as well as in social and professional contexts. So that work has enabled me to engage with it differently and to regulate my emotions and to actually look compassionately at those people who didn't have such a varied upbringing like I did.
I would love to come back. We will come back to your story in a minute, but can we just go with this bit? Because I am really curious, Samreen, about what's different about what you notice in organizations because of that belonging and not belonging, inclusion and not inclusion that you've experienced.
Yeah, I love that question. It's something I've been considering in recent years. And I guess a little bit of context. So I've been a consultant and then an executive coach for quite a few years now, actually, for 20 years. Coaching really flourished about 15 years ago. And what it's meant is I've tended to work on the margins, so with organizations, not within them. But in recent years, I did work within an organization in this particular capacity, in the same capacity. And I think that context is really relevant because it gave me a very different experience being under the skin of the being that is that organization versus consulting to or coaching to an individual or a team that's set within the organization. And it has made me realize what it has been like, and actually the fact, I'm going to be honest, I've got a bit of a bias of working on the margins and being not a part of the system, and perhaps having the luxury actually. And I've got a great metaphor that somebody once shared with me when we were making sense of my experience, But it's a bit like I'd go into the organization as if I'd dip into the ocean, and then I'd submerge myself and be there with my client system and with the people there. And and because I do have a very, very clear tendency to be ambitious and very passionate and very, very, I can immerse myself very strongly in my work. So I'd be submerged, but then when I'd then work with a different client system, I'd come out, I'd dry off, and then I'd go into the next system. When I was working within the organization, I was fully submerged, and I never came out to dry off. And that in itself was quite a sort of challenging existence, I must admit, particularly given the context of the organization at the time. But the reason why I think that's really helpful for me, because I actually feel part of my gift and part of the reason why I love what I do, and I feel I'm very effective in doing it, is because of that margin space. And although it feels like, Christmas time, for example, for a few years, I'd go, oh, I don't have any Christmas parties to go to, other than the ones that I arrange myself with because I subcontract associates. But I don't get invited, and I don't get to go to the fancy dress. And it's really interesting, the things that provoke that sense of not being a part of, not belonging, not being held as something, something that's part of an organization. But from a professional perspective, in terms of the functional aspects of my role, I think it's given me an enormous advantage.
Wow. There's a lot of themes around belonging and inclusion, aren't there, in your story?
Yes. Well picked up, yeah.
So we've got you to Venezuela, and then you came to the UK with your parents. Just pick up from there about your story.
So I lived here since, really, but I went to the international school in London, and then from there, because quite a lot of, again, it was very American influenced. It's actually the American school in London, it's called that. And I was in that system, and so I, just following the mold, and following my parents' footsteps, I went and studied in the US, and so did my brother. He was 7 years senior to me, and he was already there. So I did study in upstate New York, which was a beautiful university and absolutely amazing. It's actually very highly ranked in the it's a liberal arts education. So you don't sort of specify what you want to study, because I wasn't sure what I wanted to study. It was small, very sporty actually, but quite homogenous. So again, this whole theme of, I'll never forget this. I went out with someone who, his mother said, "What could you not have found yourself a white girl?" And I'd never ever had that sort of reference made to me, if that makes sense. And in the university, there was also quite a active, students of color group, which I obviously would integrate quite easily with, because there are a lot of Puerto Ricans and lots of different just identities in that group, and so I'd sort of fit in there, but I'd also sort of meander into all sorts of different friendships and relationships that had nothing to do with whether we looked a certain color or came from a different nationality. But I remember that was my first ever proper, if I'm honest, first ever introduction to, I'm not white, I'm something else, and actually it's being associated with something that's not desirable by my boyfriend's mother. And actually, ironically, that boyfriend years later came out and was gay. So it's fascinating how that's evolved. But I studied there. I loved it. Then I came back and I started a profession in portfolio management. So it was private banking, and did that for a couple of years. Loved it, actually. It learnt a lot of my languages. I had studied political science and economics, so it was sort of a really interesting place to start my career. I didn't enjoy making very wealthy people wealthier. So from that very early age, I started to question the purpose of what I was doing and whether I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing this. And then But I had enormous experience. We traveled around Europe. They were setting offices in Geneva, Łódź in Poland, and in Lisbon. And so I would travel to these places and, actually orchestrate quite a lot. And then eventually I decided to do a master's so that I could sort of become a little bit clear about what I wanted to do. And long story short, a really, lovely colleague of mine on the course, towards the end of our studies, had found this interesting opportunity to work at Ashridge, which it was called Ashridge at the time. Now it's called Hull EF. And at the time, there was an executive education college, a research wing, and it had an amazing consultancy. It was quite a group of mavericks, really, that integrated things from occupational psychology, psychology and psychological approaches, all the way through to some analytical approaches to help manage sort of performance, but to be very human in that process. And I was very young, mid-20s, went into that environment, very experienced consultants and professionals, and many of which took me under their wing. And I genuinely grew, like I accelerated through, had really fascinating experiences and learned a huge amount. And at that point, the Centre for Executive Coaching was born. It was around that phase. And I was very lucky because I just happened to be there and played a part. So that was my sort of professional roots. And then over the years, I've worked in a number of smaller consultancies, boutique ones, and then I've set up my own business in 2011. And around that time, I've just worked as a consultant on many projects and as an advisor to organizations in HR, functional areas. But mostly it's my coaching. That's the bit that I absolutely loved. But coming back to your specific question, which is what makes it human, because a lot of that was real context. I guess that the second bit that sort of really highlights me is that 6 years ago, in the midst of actually having built a brilliant business, I was so happy and settled and fulfilled in so many ways, because I do love my work. And I had established that sense of freedom and space, although I now look back and I question whether it was really space, because just some of my tendencies of really driving hard. And it was April 2017, around that period, just before that, my son started to experience some severe headaches, which got worse. And suddenly, out of nowhere, we learned that he had a brain tumor. And as someone who associates myself, and I probably still do, very strongly with my job, with my profession, with my work, it was a huge derailment when it came to, our lives just turned upside down. And we had a period of a couple of years just getting him through treatment, and thankfully his survival, he was amazing. And goodness me, we all learned so much from him and my daughter, his sister, who was 7 years old at the time. He was 9. And yes, we went through that journey. So that probably has created a very important imprint in me. It's stimulated questions about how does trauma show up in the workplace, actually. And then not long after we were starting to get bedded back into our lives, the pandemic hit. And that created a whole new field for me to look into. And it was at the time that I joined an organization and I worked as a leadership coach, and I set up a faculty of coaches that supported the business through a fairly significant historical joint venture and transformation, and digital transformation during the pandemic. So all those things were going on. And I had this, as I say, a field to learn and play with and support people through. So that question around how do our experiences, even those we don't remember, for whatever reason, how do they play a part in how we interact with people in the workplace now, in the present, has become a real sort of question for me to research, to work with my clients on, and to work with myself on, and my children and family.
that's why we're going to call this episode The Human Behind the Leader, Samreen.
Oh, lovely. Gosh. Yes. Yes.
Because I've just written with Lucia Baldelli a book called The Human Behind the Coach. And one of the things that we're talking about in there is that academic education, coach education gets you a certain distance, but it's our inner experience and journey. It's those difficult human things, and that that's a lot of stuff to have in a short time, isn't it? And one of the things that we noticed, but those are the things that develop the qualities that we need as coaches. And having looked at your book, those are the things that develop the qualities that we need as leaders, right?
Mm. Mm.
And you wouldn't wish them on anyone, but they happen.
Gosh, yeah, that's a lovely way of putting it. You don't wish them. I remember being in an event in Boston. Actually, we were living there for a couple of months. At the end of it was the third part of the treatment, of my son's treatment, and his radiotherapy was there because they had a particular a technology called proton beam. It's a heavier atom, so because it was right in the middle of his brain, it would sort of, it would be shot in a way that the weight of the atom stops the exit dose, so it doesn't affect the structure as much as the surrounding structures in the brain. And of course, a 9-year-old, they're right in the prime of development. So we were there, and I'll never forget this one event. They invited, the Americans are brilliant about this stuff. They invited a whole bunch of mothers for a morning. It was a Sunday morning. It was beautiful. It was in this lovely hotel. And I remember not wanting to go. I was like such a recluse at that point. So, traumatized and scared, and still, well, at that point I was finding we'd heard that the tumor had actually disintegrated through the chemo treatment. So it was great. But still, I was quite, raw and my husband said, "Oh, I think you should go. They invite all these mothers, and you'll probably connect with other people who are in a similar place to you." And I did, and it was amazing. And they had a lady speak. She was in her 20s, and she'd had leukemia younger as a young girl. And she said, "I bet none of you ever signed up to be a member of this club, yet super grateful to be here with those around you." And I remember feeling, oh my gosh, I'd never considered that. But yes, I felt so privileged to be in that environment, having been through what I'd been through with the women in that room. And I think actually it's a really interesting parallel with coaching, because the reason why I wrote the book was partly for my own catharsis, if I'm completely honest. But the other part was I want others to just really be curious about the importance and actually the healing that comes with this kind of work, whether it's in a coaching space, whether it's by writing, or by just taking that courage to having that courage to engage with it and stay with it. And I feel that the way I wrote that book was using myself as an example and as a model, as an instrument to show others that it's hard. It's not easy. Of course it's not. And some of that, it might be uncomfortable to read or engage with, but actually what comes from being there is a privilege. It's a huge privilege. So yes, I wouldn't have said it any other way. I thought it was lovely the way you described that.
And every leader has a story.
Hmm.
And as you're talking, I'm thinking, isn't it interesting how often we choose to keep our backstory as the backstory, or we feel under pressure not to be able to share that. Yes. And that has consequences on our work.
It does. And I think, in fact, it's interesting listening to you, because there's a part of us that does, and I, even when I've been obviously on a few podcasts recently as part of my bringing out the book and sharing in a more human way, aspects of it and why I encourage others to read it. And I feel that sometimes, even when asked to tell a story, there is a process that goes on within us, or it's certainly within me, that influences the choices I make about the story I choose to either share or just expose and bring out and even live through the storytelling. So there is a conscious, subconscious, unconscious interaction dynamic that's going on there. And sometimes it's laced with anxiety and I'm not quite sure people are going to think about this if I say it, and that sort of thick process. And then some of this is totally unconscious, and I think for many people, certainly people I work with, until I tickle their curiosity to maybe have a go at just expressing something that reflects how they're feeling now that may have been rooted in a previous experience or previous situation. That connection, we don't have time for it. And unless someone creates a space and holds it with lacking in judgment, but with real sort of acceptance, why on earth would most people do that?
So many things.
Sorry, I'm bombarding you.
No. Can I just download and then we'll work out where we need to go? As you were talking, in that beautiful way where you're describing, inviting people to connect with the backstory, the underneath story, the live story at work.
Yeah.
So for me, that was a big ring. Yeah, that's such an important thing, isn't it? Because if you don't talk about it in the workspace, you're splitting yourself, even though it's present in you all the time. So that was one thing I noticed. Mm-hmm. Another thing was, I heard somebody describing that if you've experienced a trauma as a child, you need it, and you go for therapy, you need to have therapy in the language that you spoke at that time in your life.
Okay, I've never
because
heard that. Okay.
If you have therapy in the language that you are in now, it doesn't have the same impact because it doesn't enable you to access the part of you that experienced the trauma.
And language plays an important role in that bridge. Okay, yes.
And the other thing that pinged was there's an American woman called Nadia Boltz-Weber, and she talks about speaking from our scars, not our wounds.
Yes.
And I wonder, as you were talking, I was wondering how much people who are able to talk about their story at work are able to talk about the scars. And it's not appropriate to talk about the wounds with everybody or to leak everywhere. But I wonder, as you were talking, I think this loops back to my first insight about giving people an opportunity to talk about it in the workplace.
Mm.
What you're describing is an opportunity, is a safe space for people to acknowledge their wounds at work.
Yes. First of all, I just want to acknowledge that difference between a wound and a scar. And I do feel that's really important. I talk a lot about them both. And I talk about wounds as a definition for trauma. Inspired by Dr. Gabor Mate, who has reminded us that the root of the word trauma in Greek is wound. So, and I do find that very helpful. I also am very conscious that scars carry scar tissue, and there's layers of hardening and numbing.
Yeah.
So I think I just love that distinction you've just shared with me, and I'm going to look her up because I'd be really interested to read more. Now, yes, I agree, and it really resonates that having the opportunity to speak from our understanding of and our connection with, whether it's wound or scar, I think it's both actually, is a skill that many of us need in order to interact authentically, but also in a way that is in service of a shared set of intentions in the workplace. and this is part of the research I'm doing at the moment. I'm really learning a lot about this, because I find that some of the interactions and I'll use myself as an example, just because I think it's only fair to use myself and actually to bring it to life. There is a pattern that I found and I learned about quite recently, actually. It's definitely stems from my ambition and my need and my drive. My mother once told me never to rely on a man when I was really young. And I actually, over the years, I thought, oh, that's such a cool thing. My mum always told me never to rely on a man. That's why I'm a little feminist, and not even a classical feminist, but as in I work, and, our domestic as well as our professional contributions have always been, on par with one another, my husband and I. And I'm really proud of that. However, I then became very thoughtful about how the power of that comment, actually.
Mm.
And the responsibility that I've carried as a result of that. Because when my son was better and we were having to come back, actually the role I needed to play was far more of a spiritual guide for my family, especially the kids, and just an unconditional presence. And that really did jar against my need to earn. So that's one example. The second bit, and this is more in the workplace, and this has manifested throughout my career, is I've had this need to not be inadequate, to be incredibly driven, and to be perceived as wanting to go above and beyond the call of duty, whatever the context was. And I realized recently that there is potentially a connection between that set of behaviors and that obsessive, actually, it was really, I'm going to be honest, it has been really obsessive tendencies, and how my father and I interacted as I was growing up. And this sounds really trivial and embarrassing to admit, but he used to call me stupid a lot. It doesn't, and he's quite OCD, so whether I stacked the dish wrong in the sink or didn't put didn't put something away properly, or whether I got my math problem wrong, his instant reaction was, "Oh, you're so stupid." And genuinely, I'll remember this. And I mean, even now, if he calls me that, you're not going to call me that now. And why? Can you tell me why? I've got some credit for them. But actually, that has left this imprint and this real sense of, I can't be stupid. I need to prove. And that has been a really unconscious driver for how I've become a professional, even as a parent and a wife, as a friend. I'm always having to compare myself. I'm noticing myself compare against several measures that sometimes are like, why am I even doing this? So, and that has been a very recent insight, actually. So that process, because I'm now aware of it, if I'm in an interaction with a colleague or a client and something comes up where I'm noticing myself either expect too much or feel defensive, that they haven't perceived what I've done as good enough, or even worse yet, I'm craving this recognition that what I've done is outstanding, I now can catch myself and I can have the conversation with the person in the moment. But I needed to do that work to truly understand the weight of these situations.
And when you described coming back with the children and in the time after he'd had his treatment, I heard in that, as you were speaking, something about it was your presence, it was your being that was the most important thing that you were doing. And a lot of what you've talked about in this conversation has been about doing.
Yes.
And you were forced,
yes.
I'm sensing, the pandemic, the treatment forced you into being the mother rather than doing the mother or the professional, the working mum, or whatever you like to call it.
Yeah. That absolutely. And I think just to complete the circle here. So I would say that in the last year, after having written this book, which hopefully really sort of validates the role that the book or my work in that has played in my own changes and transformation, I won't call it transformation, but it's significant changes, is that, ever since September this year, I've now integrated yoga practice, but really embodied yoga practices into my week, which to begin with was quite hard because didn't feel like I was doing, especially the kind I'm doing, that I'm using. And there's a lot of parasympathetic work. So getting myself into that calm, nervous system. And actually it has been incredibly rewarding, and I can feel the difference in myself. And I contemplate a lot more when I walk the dogs, and no, I'm not going to listen to a book, or I'm not going to listen to a podcast. I'm actually going to think and just feel and actually notice the nature around me, and be with the dogs and actually connect with them. And I would not have been able to do that a year ago.
Interesting. So it's all a journey. We haven't talked about your book. Well, we have, but we haven't actually named it. So, Samreen, Leader Awakened by Samreen McGregor. What's your hope for the book?
Oh, lovely. Thank you for bringing it up. So it's, as I said to you, it's, the process of writing it has already, fulfilled an unexpected hope, put it that way, in supporting myself and my work with myself. But also it brings out a lot of client stories. So really my hope is that a reader will pick it up, and some of the most rewarding comments have been, I've picked it up, I've read it, been a bit sort of, oh my gosh, I wasn't expecting this, because it's so real. It's so, I noticed there's a lot of work and research, and, to use your language, academia, that goes into helping us understand concepts, helping us make better use of our cognitive progression and understanding of things, whether it's vulnerability or whether it's emotional intelligence, all of these. But I think we are better at talking about these concepts rather than engaging with them ourselves, even those in an academic profession. And so my hope was, I don't want to talk about it. I want to show it and demonstrate it and encourage you to do the same as a reader. So that's one thing. And I obviously there's lots of illustrations and stories in there. There's an amazing woman, Candy, who did create some visceral images. I don't know how else to describe them, and to prompt and provoke and catalyze thought. So if you get a printed version or a Kindle version, it's far easier because you can see it. The Audible version, you can hear the story, so that both together, a good combo. But and I think it's somebody called it a compassionate companion. So, and this is the perfect time of year, because if you wake up on the 1st of January, anytime around this period, is to really reflect back on, where have I come from? Where was I heading? Where am I heading now? What's going on for me now that can enable me to be more conscious, to be more embodied, and to be, more choiceful, and notice where my agency lies, rather than just be pulled through life sleepwalking without an inner compass. And that's what the book is for. The book is to help wake us up, and to keep us connected with ourselves, and to have that far more conscious compass that helps us to navigate life more choicefully.
Wow. Being connected with our humanity. Leaders.
So, yes.
So the book's called Leader Awakened by Samreen McGregor, available at all good online bookstores.
It is, yes.
Samreen, if people want to pick up a conversation with you, how do they make contact?
So the best, easiest way is, well, you could connect with me on LinkedIn and reach out. And there is a website called turmericgroup.com or leaderawakened.co.uk. It accesses the same website, but from slightly different pages. And yes, you can submit a contact form and reach out to me.
Fantastic.
Reach out to us.
Fantastic. Samreen, that has been the perfect wrap to season 3 at the Coaching In. Honestly, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for coming. And everyone, thank you for listening. And we'll see you next week in season 4. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching Inn, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com.